Good evening. I'm Caroline Fingman-Griego, the Public Programs Manager at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's History Highlights program, Untold Stories of World War II. I'd like to start this evening off by extending a special thank you to our community partners for this program, the Legacy Senior Communities, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. Thank you so much for all of your support of the museum. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, museum members, and any volunteers watching tonight. Your support helps us to continue to offer programs like these. We will leave time at the end of the program for questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we will answer as many as we can. I am excited to introduce Felicia Williamson as our presenter this evening. As the museum's Director of Library and Archives, Felicia works to expand and increase access to the museum's important collection of rare books, artifacts, and oral history testimonies. She holds degrees in Library and Information Science, History, and German and European Studies. Felicia is a certified archivist and also serves on the Texas Historical Records Advisory Board. I'd now like to invite Felicia to begin her presentation.
Everybody, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm going to share my PowerPoint and we'll get started. Okay, we'll be talking about two collections that tell us a little bit more about World War II through an archival lens, but especially through a lens of underdocumented or less represented United States service members. The first is a collection that we haven't been able to talk about as much as we would like sometimes, and came in with less context than sometimes our collections do. And actually, a lot of what I'm going to do is build in some context for that collection. And that collection is the Harris collection, the Thomas and Sarah Harris collection. So this is a brother and sister who served in World War II. They're a family originating in Virginia. And we were so fortunate to receive this collection from Thomas's son, Fred, who's local here in North Texas. And it's a collection of a little over a dozen photographs, some really beautiful photographs, some of which were identified and some of which were not. And really beyond that, Fred didn't know that much about his father and aunt's service. And so our team went to work and did a lot of research to build in as much context as we could and descriptive information as we could. And then beyond that, we have to let the artifacts speak for themselves, which is what we do in the archives. So we'll be talking about that collection. The second collection I'll be talking about, maybe some of you have seen this collection on display or seen it in our archives. That's the WASP collection. So that's the Women Air Force Service Pilots collection. So that collection is also robust and has a lot of information. So we'll get there. That's for the second half. Again, if you note questions, we'll take questions at the end. I'm going to dive right in. So if you're like me and you are a history nerd and you've done your reading, you, I hope, have a broad sense or understanding about World War II, but maybe you might also be like me and not have a ton of familiarity about African Americans in service in World War II. I was, when we saw this collection, I was starting at a deficit. So I did a lot of research. My team did too, and I'm grateful to them. And we do that with any collection that comes into the archives. We do a lot of reading, a lot of context discovery to make sure we're describing the collection as accurately as possible. And so for this collection, we learned into the history of African Americans in service, and particularly African Americans both in service and also in combat, because as you'll see, the photos do tell us that Thomas Harris was in a combat position, which was unique, not entirely unique, but special. And then Sarah Harris was very special in that she was a nurse, which means that she was in a very unique position as an African American nurse in World War II. So just to set the stage, in September of 1940, the first peacetime draft begins. Obviously, to set the stage, 1939, World War II is off to the races in Europe, but in the United States is still in a bit of an isolationist stance. And we're not at war, but the clouds of war are gathering. So there is a peacetime draft. And there is an act in Congress that says there will not be discrimination on the count of race or color. However, there were significant loopholes in this act that allowed for a quote unquote minimum physical or mental standard to be upheld, and also essentially what we would call now separate but unequal facilities to be in place. And that allowed a quota system to be in place for African Americans who were either volunteering to serve and then turned away, which happened frequently, or for commanders to enact racist policies. In fact, over 2.5 million African American men registered for the draft, and many Black women volunteered. Then another big component was, of course, the home front mobilization. So there was an additional executive order requiring that there be equal opportunity for the mobilization effort. And that put in place a huge urban migration that really changed the demographics of the United States, which is still reflected in the America we know today. But that was not free of significant challenges. So what did this turn into by the end of the war? It was a bumpy ride, I'll tell you that from what my reading. And I do have citations at the end of my presentation. So there's quite a few articles and books I can recommend. If anything, I went too deep and too wide in my reading, but that's a happy thing, I think. At the end of the day, more than 1 million African American men and women served in every branch, and both in the European and Pacific theater. And in fact, our collection, small and mighty as it is, reflects that. So our brother and sister pair reflect just that story. They were decorated, although far less frequently than their service deserved. And so here we see General Patton applying a silver star to an African American for his service. And in fact, there was a long-term gap for many servicemen for the commendations that their commanders recommended. We'll see that reflected in the WASP collection as well. So if you're thinking about your American history, you might be thinking, well, goodness, these GIs are joining or being drafted, they're volunteering for service or being drafted. They're going off to either fight in the Pacific or in the European theater against fascism and tyranny, and yet they're experiencing very real challenges at home. And in fact, this was something that was discussed and increasingly brought to the forefront. And this became known as the Double V Victory Campaign. There were quite a few concerns among African Americans about fighting for democracy when Jim Crow was at its, if anything, zenith towards the end of the 30s and in the 40s. And in fact, and this was something that was new to me, there had been decreasing frequency in lynchings and racial violence throughout the 20s and 30s, in partial reaction to the increased visibility and stain from lynchings from the press. And that racial violence increased during the 1940s and was sometimes and even often targeted at African Americans in uniform. And in fact, there were episodes of Black soldiers being stationed in the South, coming from the North sometimes, and put under the I don't know what the word should be, but basically their commanders were sometimes Southern commanders who did not disagree with racist policies. That's not to say there weren't also upstanders. There's examples of military commanders trying to protect their servicemen and advocating for their servicemen. But African American soldiers throughout the US experienced quite a few episodes of antagonism all the way through violence up to and including lynchings while they were in uniform. So there was a great deal of fear and also a spotlight on the idea that the U.S. was fighting against racial and anti-Semitic policies abroad, while the United States tolerated this sort of treatment in its own borders. It's hard to read about, I'll be honest. It was pretty stunning to see some examples explored in the books and the articles I read. And in fact, well, I'll get to that later. Now I'm going to get to the collection that we're going to discuss, the Harris collection in particular. Just to let you know, on our website, dhhrm.org, there's a research tab that will take you to the archives that are available. And the two collections we'll be talking today are featured collections right there on the first page. So this top right is the Harris collection. So the son and donor, Fred Harris, his father was Thomas Harris. He was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army. And Thomas's sister and Fred's aunt, Sarah Harris, was an Army nurse. So we'll talk about Thomas first. So, and let me tell you, I mean, you know, when you work in the archives, we have thousands of photographs in our archival collection, and we love them all, but some of them really stand out for us. And this collection is just really chock-a-block with beautiful photos, and we're so glad to be able to show them to you and tell you what we've learned about them. So Thomas Harris was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army. You know, one of the challenges with this collection is that we, and in fact, his son didn't know as much about his father's service. And in fact, his name is common enough that really narrowing down and identifying his service records, despite I have a colleague, Anne Hanish, who is a crackerjack military history researcher, and she did a deep dive, and the information I'm sharing with you on this slide is directly from her research. So she was able to determine his rank and his assignments as far as we can tell. So we know that, for example, he did serve in the Pacific and European campaigns. So he went to both theaters of war. During his training, he was at Fort Hood here in Texas. And at that point, he was with the 4th Army, but that army didn't deploy overseas. So then, since we know he did go to both theaters of war, we think, but we do not know, that he's with the 92nd or 93rd Army. And just as a quote to describe why we think that, those are lesser known units, which did include African American divisions that fought both in the European and Pacific theaters. So that's why we think he went with those units after leaving the 4th Army. So it's a bit of a game of deduction there. And we'll show you why we think that here in a moment. And thanks again to Anne for identifying this. This is actually not in our collection. Anne was able to identify this using Ancestry.com, but this is Thomas Harris's draft registration card. And this was helpful because Anne was able to then use this to cross-reference Sarah Harris and her nurse Army records. So that was helpful. So we know for sure they were brother and sister from Virginia. So we know that for sure. Because again, Sarah Harris is not the most unique name, but there's only 479 to be precise, African American nurses who were given the opportunity to serve despite 10x volunteering to serve. So that number really allows us to cross-reference that service record much more precisely. Okay, so now here's to these beautiful photos. Now this is at Fort Hood, or Camp Hood as was. And I'm sure you guys, I'm going to let you take some time to look at this. We love photos like this because I think it gives you a window into the character of the individuals, a window into that history in a more personal way because it has all of their nicknames listed. Now we've seen in other collections signed photos and even signed artifacts from units from World War II, and many of them use the name and the nickname or just the nickname. But to see this really, it seems to me almost like the founding of the nicknames is something really sweet in my mind. I can rank which nicknames I would prefer over the other, but that's not my business. So anyway, I love this photo. Here's another photo. And just from an archival preservation point of view, this black substance you see on the back, this photo was removed from one of those very common kinds of albums from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. We see them all the time. We got most of the black off, which is why we can read what we can read. You can see that delicate process allowed us to get that information. But those albums are really tough on artifacts, so we tried to get as much of that off. So this is the big training class at Camp Hood, now Fort Hood, from August 1944. Again, many of the individuals are identified here, and we hope we would be able to identify future photos with this detailed name and inscription, but our fella was divided from this training class later in his service. All right, so we have a photo in combat gear. And just to kind of put this in further context, a lot of African Americans, due to frankly racist policies, were, despite their eagerness to serve, put in more service type industry positions in the Army and in the Navy and in the Marines. So it's somewhat rare to see a combat position, but it certainly happened. And as the war went on, it happened more and more. So a lot of African Americans drove trucks, were in supply chain positions and things like that. But certainly those positions were very dangerous, and the war was completely dependent on those positions. However, it is somewhat, again, unique to be an African American in a combat position. We're saying 20% versus 80% to give you a basic idea out of that million. So here we go. This is Thomas Harris and Henry Waltham Jr. wearing some combat gear. Now, we don't know more than what we're saying right here. So anything beyond this description would be a complete guess. To my eyes, this looks like Europe. We'll show you that the rest of the photos really are pretty clearly in the Pacific, however. So this is Thomas Harris in the Pacific Theater with two civilians. We think this is around 1944, but it could be into 1945. We love photos that describe in some way camp life. So here we have shaving using the old helmet as a shaving bowl. We love photos like that to give that context to the day-to-day, because a lot of photos, of course, were staged and trying to look our best and put the best foot forward. Any photo that shows behind the scenes, we just love that sort of thing. Here we go. Here's that best foot forward. So this is a photo of now Staff Sergeant Thomas Harris and an unknown serviceman at an unknown Pacific location. Again, this is all we know, so that's all we can present to you. The only side note to tell you is that by this time, Thomas was a staff sergeant, which means he was in charge of a squad of 8 to 16 soldiers, potentially including another sergeant or two. He would have been in charge of executing missions and training and supervising his squad. So you can see he's really taking quite a bit of responsibility on. He looks proud, I think. So here's Thomas Harris with some local boys. We would love to know more. Unfortunately, we don't. We're always wishing that every single photo had tons of description on the back. But sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. To add some more context to African American service members, there's a great article that Anne, our military history buff, sent me that I wanted to share some snippets from because it really puts some of the African American service into context. Because this collection came in with really photos, some of which were inscribed, some of which weren't, it helps me to see the broader story, and I think it might help you too. So this is a story, an article that was describing 4 different service members and what they did in their day-to-day. Just excuse me one second, I'm gonna drink. Oh, so this will give you a description of some of the more typical jobs that African Americans, and in this case, quartermasters, were doing in the war effort. Okay, so the first one. Young had a sense of accomplishment from his work loading ships for D-Day. I furnished the soldier who was shooting the gun, the ammunition. I load the gun, he shot it. But if my duty had to be to do what they said and they put me, if I had been put up there, I would have, but they put me here, so I loaded the gun for the other man to shoot it. The importance of the black quartermasters can be seen by how quickly they were sent into action. Once Jones' group had set up camp 4 miles inland, he said, immediately the truckers took their vehicle to go to nearby ammunition and gasoline depots, loaded up and headed to the front. Delivering supplies was hazardous. Jones said they came under fire as soon as they were within range of the enemy's artillery. To give you an idea of what they're talking about, there were 10,000 African American truck drivers who were deployed in invading during D-Day. So that gives you a little sense of what's going on. Oh, I might be underselling this. Look at my next quote. I think I'm underselling it. In 82 days, Jones and maybe it was over the course of it. Jones and 23,000 other quartermasters transported 412,193 tons of supplies and kept Patton's Third Army going as it raced towards Germany. Just as a side note, Medgar Evers, if you're thinking about where you know that name, Medgar Evers was an NAACP civil rights advocate who was shot in 1963 in Mississippi. Medgar Evers was in this division that is being quoted about, the Red Ball Express. So during the D-Day invasion, he was in this division that came, and then he was heavily decorated because of his service. And then he went on and went back home to Mississippi. He graduated with the GI Bill, became an NAACP lawyer and advocate, and then ended up being murdered by someone in the KKK. There was a really stunning series of vignettes I read, and this quote is about it, where black truck drivers were driving up the road on the Lido Road, which is over the Himalayan pass, which was supplying China as it fought back against Japan, which was significant in the war effort. If you want to really read some harrowing things and look at some harrowing pictures, I suggest you go look into that because it was a little bit mind-blowing. Okay. I wanted to end this little section over and over again in the biographies of those African American soldiers who did get approached by historians or did write down their stories. There was a sense of loss and betrayal because they were not honored in the same way that their white counterparts were. And so this is a quote I wanted to share. Years later, a salesman came by and tried to sell him a history of World War II. He said, I looked through the book and there was nothing in there about African Americans in World War II. I guess that was to keep us from getting any credit for anything we did. But without this, they wouldn't have won. I thought that was something, a lesson for the memory keepers. And I think that's a little bit of what I wanted to do by presenting the Harris collection, was to honor the brother and sister for the service they gave and try to provide a broader story and share it a little bit more, because I'll be honest, it wasn't a history that I was fully aware of, and I wanted to know more myself and share it. Okay, here's Sarah. So her story in some ways stands out even more by virtue of how hard African American women had to work to become nurses and how unique her story is. So Sarah was a lieutenant and was a U.S. Army nurse. She was one of 479 nurses out of thousands of applicants who was accepted into the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. There was a really aggressive quota. So, for example, when she was accepted in 1941, there was only 56 in the Army Corps, African American nurses that were accepted, and they were trained at segregated Army bases. By 1943, it went all the way up to 143, and by 1944, all the way up to 479. And that's compared to 59,000 white nurses. I can tell you there was a lot. I don't know if I can say that. There was attention paid to the fact that servicemen were dying and dying without care, and that there were all of these volunteers that were being turned away from the nursing corps. So there was some attention to this, and it's a spotlight on the racism that was going into these decisions. We don't know where she served. If she served in the U.S., would have been restricted to only serving German POWs or injured Black soldiers. If she was serving abroad, she, along with other African American nurses, would have been serving in Liberia, Burma, England, or the South Pacific. And so we wish we knew more about where she served and her experiences. But I'll share with you what we have, which are some really wonderful photos. Just briefly, Anne, our wonderful researcher on my staff, found her service record, and we could verify that this is definitely her. So she did have some college. She had some civil occupation skills as a bookkeeper or cashier. She was the older sister. She's 1 year older than her brother, which I always like that as the older sister in my family. And so we have that additional context. There we go. This is, sorry, there's a little fly flying around in here. This is a stunning photograph found at the National Archives. And I wanted to read a quote about it. U.S. Army nurses newly arrived line the rail as their vessel pulls out of port in Greenock, Scotland, in the European theater of operations. They wait to disembark as the gangplank is lowered to the dock. First of all, if you think about the numbers, there must be 30 nurses we can see in this photo. And if you think about, okay, there's 30, 35 maybe out of 479, and they're going right into the breach, as it were. Pretty fascinating photo. One of the few photos, frankly, you can see, which, kind of brings me to a connecting point, which is that there are so many books written about World War II and so many articles and so much archival evidence. And the percentage goes down precipitously when you go to underrepresented groups like African Americans and certainly African American women. So, this is one of the few photos I was able to find. And then researching this family was even harder. So it's just something to think about. Sorry, just one second. Um, this is a wonderful photo. We think it is a training photo. It looks like that to us, probably stateside. So it's on the reverse, it says Aunt Sarah in the Army. And we believe it to be around 1944 when she was in training. So she's on the left. And we love this photo. I'll share with you a sort of funny anecdote. We use this photo and other photos from this collection, excuse me, when we work with students. We have an artifact interaction. What's a little bit funny is that the students, we ask them, what do you think is going on in this photo? They have no idea. And we finally figured it out. They don't recognize these women as nurses because they don't have scrubs on. So they don't recognize their dresses and their hats as nurse uniforms at all. The students are just so far removed. Whereas I have actually been in a hospital and received care. I'm just old enough. I have received care from a nurse wearing a hat like that and a dress like that. So I guess that shows my age. But the students today just could not believe that the nurse had to wear something like that. But anyway, I thought that maybe you might enjoy that little anecdote. So here she is looking very proud. We believe, yes, that this is probably at her training site. So just to briefly say that, again, by the end of the war, there was approximately 500 nurses, almost 60,000 white nurses. So just almost, 0.8% of the Army Nursing Corps. Again, that I briefly mentioned it previously, that, as the casualty rate was increasing, there was some scrutiny on the fact that there was this stack of applications of women eager to join the nursing corps, and that the president and the army was ignoring it. It didn't really move the needle at all. They continued to ignore it. Just a little side note. Our staff member Anne went to the beaches at Normandy and brought back this interesting side note, which there was a very significant avenue of service for African American women in World War II, the 6888, wherein 140,000 women served in the Women's Air Corps, and 6,500 of them were Black, and they were sorting in a huge male backlog, and many of them kind of followed Patton's army. And there were 850 Black women engaged in this effort. And significantly, there are 3 African American women buried in the American cemetery in Normandy, alongside one white woman who was a Red Cross volunteer, and they are the only women buried there. So she brought back that detail, which I thought was really stunning information to note. So I'm going to just see, I saw, before I move on to the WASP, I want to see if there's questions I can answer. Were African Americans completely segregated from white servicemen during the war? Yes, the units were completely segregated. That was on order of the United States Armed Forces. They were segregated, including significantly in their training facilities. So there was supposed to be this this congressional order that there was not going to be racism or any difference in recruitment or access in the armed forces. But there was that loophole I mentioned where you had to have separate facilities. So it's this same kind of thing that comes in with segregation of education. And because that order had that loophole, often there would not be a separate barrack or training facility in place. So that led to this long delay and kind of kicking the can on allowing African Americans to join these various divisions. For example, there was a huge lag with Marines being allowed. So African Americans were not allowed to join the Marines because they kept saying, well, there's not the facilities, for example. Okay, second question. How did these collections come into the museum's possession? And how can we donate other items that our families have? Okay, so these collections, both of these collections, came from basically word of mouth family connections. So the Harris collection, one of our board members worked with the son and said, and the son was aware of the museum from the board member and approached the museum about finding a home for his family collection. I will say that in my experience, one of the challenges for a family deciding what to do with their family collection is that they're not sure their family's history collection has historical worth or value. And so that's sometimes a bridge that I can help a family get over. The WASP collection was similar. There was the niece of the originator of the WASP collection was trying to decide on a museum home for the collection, and she met with me several times about whether we would be a good museum home for it. So it ends up being word of mouth and connection and trust building with our team. And so a lot of times it's just a phone call, an email, and it's just emailing or calling the Library and Archives department. So there you go. But those are good questions. Okay, let me see how I'm doing on time. I can do it. We're going to talk about the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Okay, well, first of all, she's just cute as a button, isn't she? Her name is Catherine Parker Chatham, and she was a bright and spunky young woman from East Texas who just was not going to let the war pass her by. That's the short story. One thing to point out right out of the gate is you'll see a real difference between what we know about this collection and what we knew about the Harris collection. We didn't know as much about the Harris collection when it came in as we knew about the Parker Chatham collection. This collection came in with a handwritten memoir. It came in with a lot more description on the back of the items. And then the WASP were just heavily researched, and they're really an East Texas story in a lot of ways. So that's just a little thing to think about, like how we as archivists and archival historian deep divers sometimes have to grapple with a collection. So let me show you what I know about this gal. Oh, make my computer wake up. Oh, there we go. So the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program, it was formed in 1943. They put two separate civilian pilot programs for women together in the Army Air Forces. So the WASP were still held in a civilian status, but they were covering civilian non-combat missions, and they were relieving men from military combat duties, and really were supporting the Army Air Forces as they were preparing for war. And there were pretty dangerous missions, including testing planes and moving cargo and moving pilots. So Catherine was born in Bryan, Texas, and really was determined to become a pilot come what may. She basically told her parents, I'm going to go be a pilot, and kind of just went for it. It was kind of a brassy kind of story. She went, and there were tons of applicants to this program. So she had to beat out a lot of other young ladies. And they had to compete and go through extensive training. And then she made it through and flew as a pilot. This is a really cool, like I said, we love the behind the scenes photos. This photo is beautiful. It shows Catherine. So she's the in the center with the white helmet. So right here. And she's in the training center. And on the blackboard back here, you can see all their duties and responsibilities listed, and they're kind of, planning out their day. And also it's noting which pilots will be flying that day. I also like they're kind of just, lounging and killing time, which seems realistic. I think it's kind of a great photo. New recruits were required to be young and healthy. They had to already have a pilot's license. They already had to have logged flight time, which was on their dime and not easy to get as a young woman in the South or anywhere, to be quite honest. Then they had to go through their own training to become a women's Air Force service pilot. And they call themselves, this is noteworthy in our day and age, the Avenger Girls, which, a little branding doesn't hurt anybody. This is a photo of her co-pilots and their main, and I think her favorite training officer. And their training facilities were at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, which that's a great place and great name for it. And here's a photo of a plane taken from another plane, obviously. Just a little note, a typical training day started at 6 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m. They were running things, even though they were given civilian status. They ran things like the military. They had to clean their barracks. They marched. They did physical and drill training. They did flight instruction. They studied aircraft and weather and navigation. It was a real aggressive program. And just as a note about, the mathematics of it all, out of 25,000 applicants, only 1,000, give or take, graduated and went through and served in this capacity. So what did they do? So they flew non-combat missions, ferrying planes back and forth, towing aerial targets for gunning practice. They flight tested our aircraft, and they flew everything from B-17 to P-51. So that's pretty serious. And they worked as instructors for male pilots. I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? I love that. And did some flight training as well. So that's a pretty robust set of activities. There were, I think I mentioned it later in the slides, there were women who died in this service, and there were women of color who served in this as well. There's a great artifact in the collection. It's called "I've Got Wings." It's a flying safety manual, and it's pretty cool. I wish I had time to just show you all of it, but it's in the archives if you ever want to come see it. And there's the little mascot of the WASP is Fifi Nella, and they have a little pin, and she was designed, if you're thinking, gosh, that's a really cool mascot, you're onto something. It was designed by Walt Disney, and then Walt Disney and the Disney Corp granted the WASP permission to use it as the official mascot. So it's pretty cute. Just as a little side note, here is Catherine later in life, much later in life, wrote out her reflections of her time in the WASP, which gave us a lot of knowledge about what it was like, the main players, her colleagues, and so on, which was so helpful. Here she is with her colleagues in front of their barracks. And just to give you a timeline similar to the African Americans in their service, they were under appreciated. Far fewer of them were recognized for their service, and in fact, they were only given veteran status in 1977, and then only given the Medal of Honor in 2010, when many of them had already passed away or were unable to go accept it. Here is a photo of Catherine Chatham Walker accepting the Medal of Honor in 2010 in Bryan, Texas. So that's pretty cool. I know this is just crazy overwhelming. There's a lot of really cool links if you want to do a deep dive on African Americans or women in World War II. There's 2 books. There's more books in this than these 2, but I did use these 2 books for African Americans in World War II, Half American and Forgotten. And then there's more available, but these are the 2 I used. There's lots of really good articles, and then artifact-based deep dives available. And then here are the articles available on the WASP. And this is really just focusing on this East Texas story. So those are great too. Okay, let's see. See if there's other questions. Here. How do you begin to yeah, and if anybody else wants to join in and ask questions, please do go for it. We have 10 minutes, so right on time. How do you begin to research collections when their history is unknown? Well, you know, our starting point is always what we see in front of us. I can't tell you how often, you know, the first thing we do is really an in-depth interview with the donor to see what they know. Sometimes the donor knows a lot, and sometimes the donor doesn't. If you think about families, and it doesn't matter if the family is related to the Holocaust or human rights, some family members, you know, keep detailed records of their lives, and there's all kinds of information available, you know, and there's notes and there's memoirs and there's lots of family tree information. In other families, there's not very much information, and it's a real mystery. And maybe there's some holes in the family tree, and maybe there's kind of a little bit of a closed door there. So I've had every version of that conversation you can imagine, where I ask the donors, well, what can you tell me about this person? And sometimes they say, I don't know anything. So then sometimes we start from a real deficit. And sometimes that's very challenging. So when it comes to researching a collection, sometimes you just have to describe what you see. So some collection records are, you know, fill in the blank person with unknown in an unknown place. Sometimes you're able to, for example, we had a collection of liberator. So they were liberating concentration camps. And we spent quite a lot of time tracing back. We knew the unit the GI was with. We knew the track the GI followed. And so we basically did a lot of work to triangulate where the GI would have been and where, because we knew where the unit went as they invaded Europe, because there were some atrocity photos that we wanted to verify the location, because it's very important. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it does depend on how much significance there is. Like if there's, for example, if there's just a picture of a field, you know, there's always pictures of, like, even GIs would just take pictures of like random castle in Europe. Okay, we're not going to necessarily spend that much time unless it's going to lead us to something that we really need to know, like an atrocity photo or a significant historical fact. So if that helps a little bit, I don't know. Okay, so another question. It's almost unbelievable today that African Americans and women had to fight for the right to fight for the country. Do you know if British minority soldiers also had the same struggles? I don't know much about the British military, as it is juxtaposed with the US, I can tell you that there were reflections in some of the memoirs I read excerpts from US soldiers being treated better in Europe, which is challenging. So, they were seeing that there was, and I'm not saying they were treated better by the Nazis. Let's be clear. That's not what I'm saying. They were seeing that in certain parts of Europe, there was more acceptance and value to people than they experienced back home. And so there was some mention of that. I don't know about the British military. I don't know much about that. Okay. Can you speak more to the importance of preserving? So, yeah, so this question is about preservation and just collections in general. I have a couple of sayings about archival principles, and I think one thing is the only way either of these stories are able to be told is that the families kept a hold of these artifacts and had some insight that they had value, and then got these artifacts to a museum. And I think you'd be surprised how often it happens that we get calls where people say, "Oh, I just found this big stash of photos at a garage sale," or, "I heard about some photos that were, going to go to the curb." And you might think, well, it must be junk. Well, sometimes it's not. So I think the big message there is that if you know of you might be the only person who has that thought to preserve it, to make it, to write down information about the family member, to see if there's a reason to take it to a museum or a historical society, because the only reason these stories are preserved or available is because someone in the family kept a hold of this stuff and wrote down something about it and got it to us. It's only standing in the gap is the only reason some of these histories are preserved. And I'll also say underrepresented groups, including anybody who has experienced trauma, historical trauma, or familial trauma, tend to be less likely to preserve their history, which means that their history is less likely to be told. And that is and also there's a big confluence with the fact that historically not every archive has made a point to collect underrepresented groups. And so there are holes in our history that may never get filled because of those two big issues. Our museum is working on that, but it takes everyone working on it and making it valued. Okay. Were there protests about African American soldiers who were so the question is, were there protests about African Americans being involved in dangerous armament based enterprises during World War II? There were protests during World War II regarding African Americans for a couple reasons. One, there were really nasty protests when usually Southern towns would be aware that there would be African Americans coming and having barracks in their town, including, really some gruesome lynch mob type situations, beatings, and even lynchings of soldiers in uniform. There were situations where white officers were trying to prevent their Black servicemen from being dragged away from their base. So there were huge issues. But there were also, pretty nasty racial hazing episodes within the Army. So, but there were not, there was a pretty open willingness to send African American soldiers into any sort of situation. There was not a public outcry on that. No. Okay. Any other questions? I think, thank you all for joining me on a Wednesday night. I hope if you have time and interest, you'll do some reading. I certainly learned a lot from my deep dive. And I hope you all will come to some more of our programs coming up. Thank you so much.